I'm not sure if this counts as an alien or not, but I definitely saw something I can't explain at all about 5 years ago and have been dying to tell the story. About 5 years ago, me and 2 other friends were on our way back from Warped Tour in Maryland. For those that don't know, Warped Tour is a heavy metal / hardcore concert tour thing. We were being driven by one of our friends' moms because none of us had a car that we could drive yet. It was almost night. The sun was still out, kind of, and it wasn't dark yet, and we were driving on a 2-lane highway that had trees on either side of the road, and a median in the middle of the lanes. Basically, some creature ran out from the trees on the other side of the highway, jumped the median, and sprinted towards the trees on our side. We almost hit the thing, and our friend's mom had to slam on the brakes, and everyone in the car was screaming our heads off. Not because it was a look out for the deer situation, but because this was the scariest looking thing I've ever seen. It was black, had long, gangly limbs, and moppy black stringing hair. This thing moved so weird, I can see it clearly to this day. It even galloped so awkwardly, did not run on all fours like a deer, or anything of that sort. When it jumped off the back 2 legs, and landed again on the back 2 legs before coming down, and then galloped across the road. Everyone in the car said the same thing, which was, what was that thing? To this day, I am convinced it was a demon, or an alien, or an escaped medical experiment. It was large and terrifying, and the way it moved was unlike anything I've ever seen in my life. I wish I had more details, but sadly, that's all I remember. I've asked my friends and that friend's mom about it numerous times and years after the fact, and it still gives everybody shivers.
I'm 16, and I live in the backwoods of South Carolina. I've heard stories from the local kids of creepy things that happen in the forest, about 2 miles away from my new home. I decided to go check it out because how scary can it really be? I grab a pistol and a knife, as well as a flashlight, and I head out into the dense forest. As I'm in the forest, it starts to get dark. I turn on my flashlight. A heavy fog all of a sudden rolls in, bringing in a smell of copper and burnt hair. The hairs on the back of my neck start to stand on end. I start to hear this weird sound. It sounds like whispering and giggling. I hear something running around in the woods nearby. I hear it get louder and closer. I turn around and see something crawling extremely fast and low to the ground, on all 4 legs. Whatever it was seemed to have arms and legs like a human. I fire a shot right into its back, and I can see the blood splatter and a gunshot wound. It lets out a blood-curdling screech and retreats back into the woods. The fog lifts and the smell, suddenly, goes away. I nope my way out of there, all the way home. I get home and there it is, right in my driveway. It runs towards me and I shoot at it, but the bullets don't seem to fire. My gun was on safety. It jumps up and all I can see are its huge white eyes, and I black out. I wake up some time later on top of my dad's car, with my dad standing over me, trying to wake me up. My head hurts like nothing else and my ears are ringing. I tell my dad what had happened in the woods, and he just laughs and tells me there's probably nothing. Life as I know it goes back to normal for about 3 hours, when my dad says, "Hey Jake, mind getting me some of those steaks out of the fridge?" I look at him and say, "Dad, my name's Nick, not Jake." He just looks at me like he's full of hatred. I just give him the steaks and he just goes into his room with them, uncooked. He comes out of his room about an hour later with only the packaging and throws them away. I don't even think about asking what had happened. At 11 p.m., he tells me to go to bed, which is odd, because it's Friday and he doesn't usually care when I stay up, but I do as I'm told and I go to my room. Around 3:15 in the morning, my door opens. It's my dad. I say nothing and pretend to be asleep. The smell of copper returns to the air and I feel sick to my stomach. My dad just sits on the edge of my bed and just looks at me for what I would say to be about 30 minutes. He then mumbles something under his breath, with a voice I don't recognize. My blood turns cold, and I just lay there. He finally gets up and leaves, and I finally am relieved, but I cannot sleep the whole night and just lay there in my bed. Finally, the next morning, I get up and I go out into the living room. My dad is asleep on his lazy boy recliner, and his nose is bleeding. I wake him up and I tell him I'm spooked and I ask him about the blood. He has no idea where it came from. I ask him about the night before and he has no idea what I am talking about, and he doesn't remember waking me up from being on top of his car. My heart drops when he states that it was still Friday, when I know for a fact that it was definitely Saturday. He argues with me until I show him my phone with the day and time. At this point, we are both freaked out. I've never ventured out into the woods since then, and nothing strange has happened, except sometimes I will hear the front door open and shut a few times during the night.
I saw a UFO up close, probably from 30 feet away, tops. I'm pretty certain that it was of military design though. I was out driving with my younger brother near a military base in Tucson, Arizona, probably not even 2 miles from my house. It was about 10 p.m. or so, and there were no cars on the road. I was making a left at an intersection, and right as I completed my turn, I heard it. Approaching from behind us was this sound. Literally, the sound that they play as an effect for hovercrafts in movies. That was what I was hearing. It started out quiet, but got louder as the craft got closer. Since it was obviously heading above us, my brother leaned out the window and exclaimed, "What is that?" To which I responded by hitting the brakes. What I saw shocked me and had convinced me ever since. As I came to a stop, the craft glided above us, and I watched the wings detach like a transformer robot and lower themselves from the craft by about 10 feet. The wings at this point were supported only by 2 rods connected to the craft. There were 2 giant thrusters on each wing, as well as an even larger one at the bottom of the main body of the craft. The shape of the movement suggested that it was in some sort of VTOL mode. Because it changed into this mode, it swung around and did a complete 180 over a 2-story building just ahead of us to our left, barely missing the roof with its wings. Then it reconnected the wings, forming a triangle shape, and it boosted off back over our heads at an incredible speed. To further describe the craft, it had 2 modes as far as we could tell. One, where the craft is consolidated into a triangular shape and seems to be designed for quick horizontal travel, while the other mode allowed for VTOL movements. It could switch between modes like 5 seconds or less in this mode. It almost looked like the body of a stealth bomber, but with 2 sword-shaped objects underneath, and of course with thrusters facing like a 45-degree angle, but they seemed adjustable. The whole thing was pitch black, and we would have never noticed it had we hadn't had the radio off and heard it approaching from behind. I can come back later with a... Let me first clarify that this was 4 years ago, when I was 15 on a muzzleloader's mule deer hunt in the far northeastern part of Utah, which contains some of the most remote and beautiful places in the state. I've been frequently in and out of this area, spreading in Summit County that cuts in and out of lower Wyoming, since before I can remember, including lots of hiking, backpacking, camping, hunting, and being involved in some of my grandfather's work. I am skeptical of things not proven by methods of science, but I don't deny all of those things. I find that it's impossible for science to know of all that is out there in our vast world. My grandfather is a recently retired biologist and former conservation officer for the state, and was a regional specialist and was over wildlife and habitat management for many years. He's taken everything from habitat management programs, which is like controlled fires to benefit areas, to quite literally wrangling moose to be transplanted and darting black bears. He has seen mountain lions, bears, birds of all kinds, small mammals, plants, and natural phenomena for a majority of his life, and he understands so much that many people, including myself, will never be able to even imagine. He's scientific, honest, straightforward, level-headed. He's agnostic and is not superstitious, and often used to, lovingly and respectfully, tease a certain CO who thinks certain Bigfoot, Skinwalkers, and other beings exist. Other than that, his experience, he has never encountered an animal that he could not at least partially identify, other than the natural innate fear of being in close quarters with a bear, drunken and belligerent hunter, or incredibly potent tranquilizer medication. He's told me over and over he's never been terrified of an animal or experience like this, only curious or surprised. It was late September, and we were in a small camp by a lake in the high Uinta Mountains, hunting both grouse and mule deer with muzzleloaders. The camp was a small collection of men and women my grandfather had worked with over the years, as supervisor/biologist/CO, and these were people I grew up with. One of the women, a new wife to one of the guys, had shot a buck deer, injuring but not killing it immediately, and they had lost track of it. Devastated by the thought of wasting the animal, she returned to camp in the afternoon upset and concerned that the deer had run into an even more secluded area of the mountain, which was hard to reach from the trail that she had shot from, a place my grandfather was familiar with because it was such a pain in the ass to get to, with lots of deadfall and steep terrain. We volunteered to go in the late afternoon to search for the deer, following a scant blood trail that she had tracked for a while before getting fatigued and intimidated by the terrain. Because both my grandfather and I were in good shape, and he was so familiar, it didn't seem like a big deal. Before we left, she mentioned hearing what she assumed was coyotes, which made her even more so concerned that if the deer died, they would ruin the meat and hide before she could harvest it. We took off in the early evening, expecting to be back within an hour or two after searching and having our guns with us, in case we found the animal still alive or came across another buck worth trying to harvest. It was steep in places, with lots and lots of deadfall of varying heights, making the hike slower and more tedious than we had hoped, making us understand the other hunter's fatigue. She had marked the blood trail with bright orange pieces on the trees, which we followed for maybe 20 minutes, and then got it hard to track. The sun was getting close to setting at this point, and we knew getting out would be just as long getting in. We had just about decided to stop when we found a spot near a fallen tree that looked like it had been recently bedded down in, followed with splatters of fairly fresh blood, and we continued for longer. When the sun had just about set and the light had faded from the trees, we removed the firing caps from our guns to make them now completely safe, as it was now illegal and irresponsible to hunt in such absence of decent light. My grandfather pulled out his large mag light flashlight from his pack, and I put in my headlamp to begin the hike back, using our GPS to find the trailhead. About 10 minutes on the way back, we started to hear more movement among the trees. It was normal for animals to start moving now that the sun had gone down, as animals would likely be starting to head towards the clearings for water or to graze in the safety of lower light. Small and distant sounds of crunching leaves, patterns of hooves, animals, or small bits of movement in the trees from squirrels or birds were common and expected. We did not expect the deafening, disturbing sound we heard next, which vaguely and initially reminded me of a coyote howl. But by a few seconds in, it was unidentifiable, frightening, and human-like. It started with what sounded like a person screaming, but then got louder and more intense, with a screech quality to it, so unlike any coyote or any animal we have ever heard. Then was the almost chattering that came in between the shrieks, and the movement of trees became almost calculated, almost threatening. We stopped dead in our tracks, frozen as my grandfather started using the light to look around. I was far more freaked out than him at this point. He just seemed perplexed, curious, and a little baffled at what could make that sound. It sounded human, but with no words, with no urge of tone of help or I'm just screaming to mess with you. We continued on after it mostly stopped, and it seemed like the other, natural and distant sounds had gone almost silent. I listened intently to the sound of my boots crunching with the dry aspen leaves underfoot, trying to tell myself that it was just some weird coyote with a horrible deformed larynx or something. Maybe 20 minutes from the main trail that would lead us to the truck, we heard the chittering sound again and sounds of thumping against dead trees. Looking around with our lights, in between deadfall, maybe 12 to 15 feet in front of us, was a large human-looking thing. It was almost hunched down with a long, slender arm around the front of a standing aspen. The aspen, of course, was pale white, with the knots being dark brown, and whatever it was had skin almost as pale. I caught a very brief glimpse of its face. It seemed round and the eyes seemed sunken, and I cannot tell you eye color other than a flash of reflection on the eye from my light, and that its face seemed sunken and emaciated. I didn't see any fur or hair. I never felt like it looked right at me. More my grandfather, and just in our direction, almost confused and curious, like he was before with the sound. For a mere couple of seconds, I caught a glimpse of it, but that was it. I looked down at the ground, holding my eyes shut, trying to imagine being safe and secure in the truck, and my grandfather took a few stumbling steps backward toward me. I heard the thing go off to our side, moving quickly and with purpose through the trees, to the side and then dropped down behind us. I would assume according to the sound, of course, but I hope it went in the opposite direction. My grandfather turned to where it had veered off, as to follow it, but he soon stopped and looked at me. I had never before and never since seen him so confused, baffled, horrified, curious, and in awe. I was crying at this point, ugly crying, trying to muffle my shaking breath and voice, and I asked him, "What was that?" Over and over I asked, and he had no answer for me. He pulled his gun off his shoulder and put a cap back on the nipple of the igniter, making the gun live, and he then carried it in front of his body in his arm. He pulled out another headlight to put on himself. We started walking again towards the trail as he listed off like talking to himself as to what it wasn't. Things like, couldn't have been a deer, or elk, or moose. It had arms, it was hunched, it stood upright. Or, a bear? A very sick bear. It could have been a bear. Was it the light? We heard the sound, the screeching human howl distantly once more before reaching the trail, which was dirt and gravel, but fairly flat and no deadfall. We practically jogged to the truck. I locked the doors immediately and sobbed, and my grandfather turned on music as loud as possible to try and distract me on the way back to camp. I was a mess when we arrived back, and he went to talk with the others by the fire when he got me settled in my sleeping bag in my bunk. He explained to some of his friends, but I don't know what all was said. The next day, everyone was extra sweet to me, trying to comfort me and saying it was probably a sick animal that looked scary in the dark. The deer the hunter shot was found the next day, in the daylight, scavenged quite harshly by what I assume was coyotes. To this day, he has no clue what it was, nor what that sound was. And before and since, I've heard both coyote and many other animal sounds that never even compared to that sound. The scientist in me, and in him, the hopeful and blissfully ignorant people in us hope and speculate it was just a deformed, sick animal in scant light. But I still have no clue what that thing was, and I hope I never experience it again. Oh, and to give a little extra detail before I forget, it seemed tall. It wasn't small in stature. Even though it was sort of hunched down and over, its torso and arms seemed long, and based on the length of arms, it had to be tall, or else its arms would be dragging length on the ground. It was bony. It truly looked emaciated, like an animal that hadn't eaten in a long time, or that was ill. Its skin looked anemic and unlike a person. I couldn't tell much of a green or blue undertone in the arm or face that would sort of indicate superficial veins. It looked dehydrated. I don't remember getting a good look at its hands, but its arms were thin, as well as lanky. I don't remember seeing ears, and remember that its mouth was sort of small. I don't even think its mouth was open. Unlike a human, it didn't have lips or pigment to its cheeks. Its head was tilted slightly up, which is because I think my grandpa was slightly closer than I was. Its neck seemed longer than a human's, and the tendons of the neck seemed to be pretty obvious. Like if a thin person extended and flexed the neck, you can see the tendons and delicate musculature. Its eyes, they seemed sunken and set back, hollow almost. There was that very distinct flashback of light from its eyes, which is because of the thin membrane just behind animals' retinas. Humans do not have this biological feature. Once I saw it, I shortly after began crying because not only was I creeped out, but because of the sounds we had heard and the fact that I felt my beloved grandfather and I were vulnerable to it, but because I was disturbed by how unfamiliar and unnatural it was. While in high school, I worked at a vet clinic as a veterinary technician and have seen sick animals, large and small. I've seen animals hit by cars. I've seen them cut up and torn up, anemic, infected with parasites or mange. I have worked on animals just before death, and I have seen animals dead. I've seen animals during necropsy, and have also seen wild animals hurt, dead, or sick. This was like all the weirdest and most disturbing attributes of a hurt, dead, or sick animal, sort of balled into one disturbing being. I think that is why I was so upset, because I could not have understood what it was, and how something so disturbingly dead and lifeless looking could be standing there looking at us, breathing and living and curious about us. I'm a person of science, like yourself it sounds like, so none of this made sense to me. Science is safety. Logic is safety. At least to me. If it was a black bear or elk or mountain lion, I would have known how to react. I would have known if it was dangerous. Honestly, I still hike and hunt up there, but when I think about it, it scares me half to death. A scared animal that felt cornered, trapped, threatened, or even territorial probably would have, and I think that given its stature, it would be able to at least scare us off and do minor damage if physically it felt threatened. The next point I want to make here is if it was predatory, it could have gone one or two ways. One, if it wanted to hunt, kill, or eat us, it could have attacked us and tried. Two, if it was predatory and wanted to hunt, kill, eat us, it could have decided not to because of many reasons. There were two of us. We weren't very small and we weren't injured. We had lights and a gun, or a weapon, or some sort of large protective object. We weren't what it typically goes after, or it had already been satisfied with a different animal. Look, obviously it didn't attack us, but both of the options are terrifying to me. We were in fact alone, secluded and without our weapons and lights, probably not too dangerous to it. This disturbs and horrifies me. But I also wonder if this thing is what so many others have seen. Why has nobody been hurt? I wish I could debunk, discredit, or even explain away what we saw that night, but I can't. My dad's got kind of a wild story that I'll share with you. I mean, it's not much of a story as it is a single event. Back when he was younger, in his 20s, he went down to Australia for a month for work, or something work-related, I remember. Ended up going hiking out in the Australian outback for miles on end, and got lost for over 7 days. And at the time, he told me he saw all sorts of beauty of nature. He even ran into some indigenous people, and then claims he was attacked by an upright walking wolf that telepathically told him it was going to rip his heart out. Crazy, I know, right? It scares me because my father is a die-hard science, no lies kind of guy. He has to have evidence in front of him if you try to convince him of something. He's always been that way. For him to tell me about it as openly as he did disturbed me. He has some pictures of the trip that he took, not that part obviously, and has truth to anything he's ever told me about. He told me he fought this thing off with his bare hands and it left horrible claw scars on his thighs, chest, and arms, which he does have those scars. He also said this upright wolf was as tall as him and had a more slender build, but tapered at the waist like a dog. I don't know if this detail matters at all, but I've always been a huge fan of Diablo 2. For those that don't know anything about it, it's a video game. In it, you can play a druid class that shapeshifts into a werewolf. I was playing a character of mine who happens to be a druid, and was in said werewolf form when my dad happened to see me playing it, stopped for a second and said, "Hey Jory, remember that time I was in the Outback? That guy you're playing kinda looks like what I fought off out there." Again, maybe it's an irrelevant detail, but it just stuck with me, and I thought your viewers might like to hear it. It's just kind of interesting to make that correlation. This happened about 10 years ago when I lived in Limestone, a small town in Maine. For reference, I lived in a small apartment complex completely surrounded by forest. It was very quiet, and lots of wildlife roamed the fields and forests surrounding the complex. I was 8 years old, lying on the top bunk of my bed, looking out my window. There was a spider that would build her web right outside my window, so I would always watch her build her web at night before I went to sleep. My window overlooked a parking lot that was right next to a field bordering a thick forest. One night, I was watching Mrs. Spider build her web, as I always do, when I see this very tall, ape-like thing with a long, thick tail that tapered at the end, kind of like how you would imagine a T-Rex tail, except hairy, if that's a good comparison, walking across the parking lot. I kept watching as it wandered into a field just before the forest. It then placed itself between two other trees, about arm's length away from each other, and began climbing up by grabbing the two opposite trees with its respective hands and feet, and slowly shimmying up the tree. As it made it to the tops of the trees, it sort of blended in with them and stopped moving, and I couldn't see it anymore. To this day, I am completely stumped as to what I saw from my apartment window. I'm not a country person by any means, but I've been wanting to own some land for a while now, so I can have my own chickens and goats. I've lived in town for years and years, and finally saved up enough to move out quite a ways out of town. Yeah, my commute is longer, and that really sucks, but I'll tell you what, nothing beats standing out on your own front porch in the morning, greeted by silence. I love to just stand outside in the morning and take a piss off my front porch with my schlong out, exposed to the cool morning air and no one around to shield it from. It doesn't get much better than that. I got a chicken coop built and got a few chickens at the time, and things were great for a while, until I learned there was a giant upright wolf coming in the evenings and taking and killing my chickens. I now no longer have chickens or a chicken coop. I only have a small pistol that I keep around my house, so it's all I have. I'm not a guns expert by any means, so I don't own a lot of firearms, really just my pistol. I took a step outside on the evening in question for a smoke, and I heard a bunch of commotion going on over by my chicken coop. This bastard raises its head with 3 chickens in one hand, dead, and him and I lock eyes at each other. At least I was assuming it was a him. I was scared. I froze in the moment. I had my pistol on me in that second, but I was so in the moment that I didn't even think to shoot at it. It was almost trance-like if I had to explain it to somebody. It turned around and started walking off when I realized it had just killed and took some of my chickens. I'm screaming at it, still not pulling out my gun. What in God's creation was I even looking at? When I say it walked off, I literally mean this thing stood up on 2 legs and walked off. It was massive, tall, and looked to be around 400 pounds plus if I had to guess. It was brown and gray colored. The next evening, it came around again, and as soon as I saw it, I started shooting at it. It immediately raised its right arm up over its face, like it was shielding itself from the light. I want to say that I emptied a clip into it, but it felt like the bullets didn't even faze this thing. It was like shooting a military-grade vehicle with a BB gun. Ting, ting, ting. Not even a dent. Do you know what I'm saying? The bastard took more of my chickens. Actually, it took all of my chickens. Once all my chickens were gone, it stopped coming around, and I clearly was powerless to stop it. I haven't gotten any goats yet, and With this, I decided against it. My neighbor, who is a very sweet old man, heard the commotion and showed up at my property a little bit later, asking if everything was okay and if I needed anything. Told him what had happened and explained he's had the same issues. He said he's lined his farm with a fine layer of salt, believing it was something demonic and not of this world. He tells me it hasn't come back since, so he thinks it works. Offered to allow me to keep a coop on his property if I wanted, but I declined, not wanting to deal with it. I'm newer to the ways of country living, so it is probably a good idea for me to invest in heavy, hardier guns. Backstory. Towards the tail end of the summer of 2018, my family was house sitting for my cousin in North Carolina. The house itself is very large, so the kitchen living room is right next to the kitchen. Light kitchen can be seen from the living room fully, which had a hallway that wraps around the master bedroom and back down to the living room. Next to the living room was a staircase to the loft, where me and my sister were sleeping. And in the living room, there was a door to a balcony, deck that overlooked the river. It had huge windows that let you see the balcony. On this night, me and my mom stayed up till 1 a.m. watching Law & Order, but went to our rooms around 1. Okay, we were staying for 8 days and this happened on the 5th night. I could not sleep because I felt like something was watching me, and at around 4 a.m. I heard a shriek, like nothing I've ever heard before. So an hour later I decided to see if I could sleep on the couch in the living room. I noticed that I kept hearing paws walk up and down the hallway I mentioned. I go, okay, it's just their cute little dog. Except that she is laying on the other side of the couch, where I see her while the footsteps are going. Then, I hear the most guttural noise I've ever heard. It was like a growl and a scream mixed into one. So at that point, I freeze. I close my eyes and pretend to be asleep. After about 20 minutes, the sun rises. I ain't no idiot, so I run to the kitchen and get the biggest flipping knife there is to look around. Nothing out of the ordinary, except I look out the window onto the balcony. The windows were fogged up as it had been raining last night, and clear as day, written on the window through the condensation, was the word hi. I don't know where I stand on the whole UFO controversy, but I can vividly recall an experience from my childhood that I've never forgotten and cannot explain. I was maybe 10 or 11 years old. I distinctly remember it because it caused me a sense of terror, more pure than any I had had or felt since. My parents' house is out in the country, and my old bedroom is on the second floor, with 2 windows facing north and west respectively. My bed was up against the west wall, just beneath the window. My dog Henry was sleeping with me that night. I woke up to the sound of Henry barking and found my room bathed in light from the window above my bed. I can vividly recall Henry silhouetted, staring into the light, barking her brains out. I jerked up and looked out, but there was only light. A crackly, humming, droning sound filled the air. I was disoriented and terrified, both for myself and for my dog, but all I could do was pull my blankets over my head and curl into a ball. I was sure Henry was going to die. I remember feeling sorry that I was too frightened to help. In my head, the clear thought of, I don't want to die, repeated over and over, and I wasn't aware that it was the first time in my life that I had ever really not wanted to die. Like, it was the first time I'd ever genuinely felt that I was going to die. The experience ends there. I woke up the next morning with Henry in my bed. I immediately went to my parents' room and woke them up to ask if they had seen the light or heard Henry barking, but they hadn't. I wondered if I dreamt it, but I'd never had a dream so visceral before. All the fear I'd experienced up to that point became a lower classification. Now there was fear, and there was real fear. When I first heard about sleep paralysis, my mind immediately went to that night. It had some of the same characteristics, the terror, the vividness, the weird noise. But I wasn't paralyzed. I moved twice. Once when I sat up and peeked into the light, again when I pulled my blankets over my head and hid. When I was a kid, I lived in a place called Black Hammock Island in Jacksonville, Florida. I always had the curtains in my bedroom open at night to let the natural moonlight in. One night, I was sitting against my closet door, which was opposite my window. The light was off, and I was on my phone. The reason I was sitting there was because there was only one working outlet in my room, next to the closet, and I needed to charge my phone. I looked up and saw what looked like a pair of glowing golden eyes that were like a pointed oval shape, and they slanted down towards the middle. They were huge. At first, I thought it was somehow a reflection of light, as I had my phone on and a nightlight plugged in the same outlet, so I unplugged it and turned my phone screen off. When I realized that it looked like eyes and wasn't a light reflection, I got up and ran out of my room immediately and banged on my grandparents' bedroom door. When I told them about it, they told me it was probably an animal. The thing is, our house was not directly on the ground, but it was propped up on tall stacks of bricks. It was a portable home. It was way too high for something like a bear, which I'm pretty sure doesn't have those types of eyes anyway. There was nothing that an owl could have been perched up on, and the eyes were way too big for that either. The eyes, for the short time I saw them before running out of my bedroom, were staring right at me unblinkingly. To this day, I'll never sleep with my curtains open, and I still have no idea what that could have been. Does anyone have any ideas on what I saw that night?
This story happened a couple of years ago. It was me and my group of friends that we would go camping with quite often. It was our junior year and we had 2 weeks left before school started. We wanted to have fun and we decided to go camping, deep out into the woods. During this time, me and my friends were kind of into survivalism. We wanted to go camping with the bare essentials. We only brought some food and some tools that we could build a shelter with, and a couple of sleeping bags. I also brought a tarp just in case if things didn't work out. We literally picked a random patch of woods to go camping in. We went early in the day and tried to set up camp. We found a couple of sticks and logs and tried to put them together to make a shelter. I'm actually quite impressed looking back on how well we did. It did take us about 4 or 5 hours to make a decent shelter for all 4 of us. I wouldn't recommend it. After spending most of the day building our shelter, we were pretty hungry. As we were eating, it was around 6 or 7 in the evening. We decided to tell some scary ghost stories to make things more fun. We told your basic ghost stories, nothing too crazy. There was one that was kinda good, but wasn't that scary. As the night got later and the fire got more dim, that's when the more interesting stories came out, and we started talking about Skinwalkers. I had heard about them before, but I haven't heard about some of the additional information that I heard that night. Apparently, Skinwalkers used to be people, and they kind of sold their soul to the devil or something. By doing so, this granted them powers, the ability to change from one shape to another, mostly animals. I kinda had an idea about that, but this I didn't know. When you spoke, or even thought of the word Skinwalker, it would draw their attention to you. Of course, me and my friends were skeptical about this idea. That's kinda silly, don't you think? Deep down though, something about that kinda terrified me. From that point on, I was kind of on edge that evening. As the fire was practically out, we'd realized that all the noise outside had suddenly stopped. All the wildlife, all the animals, stopped making their usual noises. Even the bugs that constantly bugged us during the evening had stopped making noise. Everyone, as if at once, ears kind of perked up into the air, searching for that sound, hoping for something normal to be happening. But deep down, we knew that it wasn't. Something was happening. It was bringing out this primitive nature of us that kind of put us on edge, as if there was a predator nearby. None of us said anything. We just listened to the crackling of the fire as it slowly faded into the night. As the fire got dimmer and dimmer, we could hear something getting slowly and slowly louder, as if it was approaching us from a far distance. This sound was accompanied by this horrible smell. It was as if there was rancid meat being hung from this dirty trash can. that was blowing right into all of our faces. Being the tough guys that we were, and the idiots, we realized that none of us had packed a flashlight, kinda going with the theme of survivalism and having the bare essentials. There was definitely something in the woods, making its way through the brush. Whatever the creature was, it didn't sound small. It could have maybe been a moose or something, but during this time of year was quite unlikely. All of us were quietly scanning the tree line, trying to see if we could see what it was that was stalking around our campsite. That's when I had this odd idea. I told all of my friends about what we heard earlier about the Skinwalkers. I told them all to stop thinking about them, and that hopefully they would go away. Normally, my friends would have made fun of me for suggesting such a silly idea, but I think they were so scared that they had no choice but to agree with me. I then brought up a random conversation, anything to take our minds off of what was happening, and it seemed to be working. The sounds from around our campsite seemed to be going away, as did the smell. About 30 minutes later, it was as if all things were back to normal. The sounds of the forest came back to our ears, and we were pretty excited. I then made the suggestion that we should pack up and go back home, considering what was going on. It was about 1 in the morning, but it seemed like a better idea than staying out here for the rest of the night, especially with those creatures. I proposed the idea, and unanimously, my friends all agreed that we should have left a long time ago. One of the perks of not having much material when you go camping is that you don't have to pack up as much. We were packed up in about 15 minutes, all 4 of us, including putting out the fire. We were out of our campsite in record time, back onto our trail, hiking back to our cars. Unfortunately, this hike was about 20 minutes, and none of us had a flashlight. As we were hiking, I couldn't help but think what had happened earlier. That's when the smell came back. But not just the smell, the sounds of multiple creatures coming through the woods slowly approached our rear. There wasn't just one creature. There was at least 3 of them. My friends seemed to be catching on, and we tried to return back to our tactic of not thinking about it. But we were out in the woods with no light, being stalked by 3 skinwalkers. The task of not thinking about it was nearly impossible. We were about 10 minutes in when we started hearing what sounded like our friends being mimicked by a weird radio. The sound sounded staticky, and it wasn't quite perfect impressions of our friends. The skinwalkers were mimicking what we had been saying all night, saying phrases that we had said that evening, as if they'd been listening, trying to perfect what we say and how we say it. My friends wanted to stop and try to turn around and confront these creatures. I told them that was not possible. We had to keep moving forward, or else. At this point, we start sprinting down this trail. We have no idea where we're going. It's pitch black, and the things behind us are now screeching and screaming, these terrible sounds. We finally go to where we think our cars are. By some miracle, we are able to find our way back to our cars. At this point, all of our gear has been dropped, and we have nothing but our shoes and clothes on our backs. We all jump in my truck, and thankfully it was a 4-door. We're all inside, and I turn on the car, and my headlights are on, facing the woods that we just had exited. The sight that laid before us was terrifying. About 20 yards away from us, in the woods, stood 3 creatures. They were all about 8 feet tall. The creatures looked like a crossbreed between a moose and a wolf. All of them had very large antlers. Some of them were broken off. Some of them were stained red. But all of them had very, very large teeth. Their eyes were a piercing red, and it was as if they were glowing. But all of these features do not come remotely close as to what was most terrifying about these creatures.
UFOs, even after
They were
having the
all
experience,
standing
though
on their
I have no good
hind legs.
explanation of what happened. I'm a pretty staunch atheist, and I don't tend to believe in something unless there's a reason to. I don't even trust my own experience, even if it was corroborated by others. but this one was really hard to shake off. I was riding home through the country one evening, rural Kansas, and had 3 other friends of mine in the vehicle with me. We were totally sober, because I feel like that matters, and we were about 20 miles or so outside of town on a country road in the middle of nowhere. It was about 11:30 at night, late enough that there really wasn't any other traffic on the road, but not so late that it was in the middle of the night or anything. I was in the back passenger seat, looking out the windows just into this dark farmer's field that has just a tree line that paralleled the road. All of a sudden, just behind that tree line, it's about 100 yards from us, I see blue lights flashing behind the tree line, and I turn towards my friend who's driving and tell him to slow down. We pull over to the side of the road and look out towards the tree line. At this point, the lights are directly perpendicular to our position on the road, but we were behind the tree line. At first, I'm thinking it's like an electrical substation blowing up or something. But then the blue lights change and start flashing in all kinds of different colors, becoming more and more rhythmic and bright, casting God rays through the dust over the tops of the trees. At this point, I had stepped out of the car and was watching as the God rays began to descend towards the eye level. Whatever it was behind the tree line was rising up towards the tops of the trees. At that point, my friend starts screaming for us to go. We jump back in the vehicle, and he takes off like a bat out of hell, flying down the road. The lights continue to rise until they were perfectly level with the treetops, and whatever was on my other side starts chasing the car, staying just out of clear view behind the other side of the tree line. My buddy pegged the car out over 90. It was a family car, and not very fast, and the thing kept perfectly alongside of us almost the entire way back to town, and then winked out just before we got there. We talked about it for an hour at a gas station just inside of town, and then decided that we wanted to go back and see if we can find whatever it was we had seen, but this time took dirt roads that paralleled the country road. So, we'd been on the other side of the tree line. When we got back out there, we saw fire trucks all over the place driving slowly with spotlights aimed at the field, looking for something. They were canvassing a large area covering about 3 miles. I called the fire department to ask them about it the next day, and they said they had gotten reports of lights or fires from several people over a large area, but they were unable to find anything. To this day, I have no idea what we saw. This is the craziest UFO phenomena true story, and it came from my dad. 1960s in Ethiopia. My dad is just a child, 9 years old at the time, playing with his best friend Gabriel after school. They were playing in the fenced backyard of my dad's house. My dad turns his back for a second, then turns to look back at his friend, and Gabriel is gone. It's important to note that my dad and Gabriel were from the top 1% of Ethiopia's ruling elite. My dad's father was Minister of Interior of Ethiopia, and Gabriel's father was a 4-star general of Ethiopia. The backyard Gabriel disappeared from had 10-foot brick walls with armed guards patrolling on the outside. A couple of hours pass. His parents, my dad's parents, and guards are searching, but no Gabriel. 48 hours pass. Now, there is a nationwide search for this important general's kid. It's on the news. Police are searching door to door, describing him and what he was wearing when he disappeared. He was wearing at his private school uniform, white shirt and brown pants. Helicopters even searched the countryside looking for him. Still nothing. A month passed, then 2, then 4. People start losing hope that he would ever be found, and think the worst. Exactly 6 months to the day that he disappeared, Gabriel appears back in my father's backyard. He was still wearing the same white shirt, private school uniform, and it was clean. He looked exactly the same as he did when he disappeared. This is where it starts to get weird. Once they had confirmed that he was okay, they started asking where he had been. He said a couple of nice men took him on a trip. He was in a white room that glowed, and other children were there from different countries. He said he was surprised that the nice men who looked like white guys could speak Ethiopian, and he could understand what the other children were saying, even though they were not Ethiopian. The white glowing room had no windows, and the doors disappeared into the walls. There were buttons on the walls, and if a kid pushed them, a bed would come out of the wall. He said he was then all of a sudden in a city that was glowing, clean, and cars were flying around him. He said there was people, but they looked really strange. Like us, but different. One nice man was still with him and took him to a tall building, where he said he had to stay there for a while, but showed him a room that he could use for entertainment. Gabriel said that he could push a button and the room itself goes places. An open field, the beach, the room itself even flied. He said after a couple of hours he was taken back to Ethiopia and appeared in the backyard. He thought he was the only one gone for a couple of hours total. No one believed him. And Ethiopia being a super religious country, most adults around him thought he got possessed by the devil. Gabriel even was forced to see a priest and get the evil spirits out of him. My dad still kept in contact with him throughout their lives. Gabriel got a doctorate in physics, and I believe he currently works in Holland. Where I live, I have to drive an old highway to and from work. I'm on this road for roughly 40 minutes to where I have to work at. This highway takes me through much more desolate farming areas, but also short bursts of small neighborhoods with houses and turnoffs here and there. There's always one section of road that kind of freaks me out. It's in a much more rural farming area, so it's primarily all cattle and agriculture. No houses in sight. Since I have to be at my place of employment early in the morning, I'm usually driving in the dark. I've seen large shadows dart across the road in this stretch of road. I've gotten ominous feelings like something bad was going to happen. The other weird thing is, I've been seeing a lot of dead deer on the side of the road, and the pull-offs. I don't normally see much deer around here, so it's weird. These aren't just dead deer on the side of the road, like they've jumped out and gotten hit. Especially the volume of dead deer that have been popping up is also strange. In fact, most of the time it's pieces of deer. Yes, like half a deer body, but no head. In fact, one time there was a deer head on the side of the road by there. Last I saw was the upper half of a deer on the pull-off. Looked like it had been ripped in half. It wasn't eaten on or anything. I don't know what kind of vehicle does that to a deer, unless it got ran over. I didn't even see any blood. Cleanup crew takes their time doing this road since these carcasses will stay present for at least a few days. On my way home from work, it's bright out, so I can clearly see what's become of these deer. The highway is driven on, but it's not exactly a high-traffic road by any means. Just a simple 2-lane highway. Nothing special. I rarely if ever see somebody else behind me or coming in the oncoming lane on my way to work, so I keep my brights on most of the time. It's been this way since I've had my job for the past 4 years, but only in the past couple of months has this part of the road gotten so weird. Besides the deer, I've only seen those large shadows running across the road and around the pull-off. It scares me and I don't like thinking about it, especially the speed of whatever it is I've been seeing. It's large and very fast. I assume it has to do with the dead deer, but I don't know. It happens so fast that I can't make out a distinctive shape. Just being able to tell it's a large black mass. I hate driving this section of road every morning. It sucks. I'm always worried that something is going to happen. I've only seen some of these figures 4 or 5 times now, and the dead deer have been constant. To be honest, I really don't want to see why there's so many dead deer, and or what these large dark shapes are that are running around. It freaks me out to even talk about it. Knowing that I gotta go out again on Monday morning makes me dread my commute. All of this has been happening since the beginning of January. I have no idea if that time of year has anything to do with what's been happening. This happened a few years back. It was midwinter, had snowed heavily the day prior, and was cold as hell. I decided to take my husky out to the woods since he loves the snow and the cold weather, and I love the scenery. The trip was uneventful, to say the least. Took our usual trip to a nearby field and started to head back home. But this time, Instead of our typical way back, I decided to go off course and go into the denser part of the woods. My intent was to enjoy myself more of the snowy forest, but it quickly took a more sinister path. As we were walking back home, I noticed rabbit snow prints appearing out of a nearby hole in the snow, which stretched for about 10 meters onto a nearby tree. As I got closer, I noticed that the rabbit's trail had disappeared. I looked behind the tree and found that there was human snow prints, barefoot human snow prints. I followed the trail again. Meanwhile, my dog is barking and pulling me in the opposite direction. They looked like the person making them was drunk or had never had feet before. They swerved zigzag-like, probably 30 meters after appearing the human feet, turned into hooves and continued to trail off. Now at this point, I'm scared shitless, confused and unnerved while my dog is next to me, barking and trying to pull me away. I just start booking it back to my house. That's basically it. I just wanted to share it and maybe hear somebody's thoughts about what it could have been. I live in Eastern Europe, so I don't think it could have been a skinwalker.
I get home from work. It's almost midnight. The door opens and the home security system does that high-pitched beep 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 chime. I'm in my kitchen eating a late dinner before going to bed. I hear a door open and then the home security thing go beep beep beep, but it definitely sounded like it came from outside. I'm sitting right by the back door, so I go check the front door. The front door has a screen door and a wooden door that leads to a small entry room, then a second door inside that leads up the stairs and into the house. These are loud, old doors. I didn't hear the screen door open, and I didn't hear the main door close, but I also didn't hear the second door open. The door is just double locked and no other doors are opened. Nobody is standing outside. Okay, maybe it was the neighbor's door, and maybe they have the same system. I hear it again, and it sounds like it's coming from outside of the front of the house. I look out the window. It looks like there's a deer outside. It's crawling on the yard, with its belly on the ground. It decides to stand up and continues to stand up, but on its back legs. The deer makes the beeping sound, with its head raised up into the air. It's not a deer. It looks like a guy, but with deer legs. It's too dark to see what's really going on.
I'm home.
What the F?
I'm home.
The creature sounds like a dog is barking, but is trying to vomit at the same time. It starts to gallop away and across the street. Beep, beep, beep. What's weird about this is that I do not live in a rural area. The deer population typically stays down towards the outskirts of the city. I have never seen or heard anything like this.
So, I've been seeing this super tall and skinny thing in doorways and running in halls. It's like a white, fleshy color and has rather sunken facial features. It seems to be more afraid of me than I am of it. Or maybe it just doesn't want to be caught. Or could it be something else? I've spent most nights not worrying about it, but it's showing up a lot more, almost braver each time. If anyone knows anything about it that could give me more insight, so I could get some more detail, please say. I seen it again today and it paralyzed me in fear, to the point of tears upon it holding a stare. I've declared that I know it's there and want it gone, and that it's not welcome. It looks like the rake, no joke. My sister thinks it might be a skinwalker. I've read a bit about them, and it worries me as to where it's coming from and where it goes. Also, why it's after me and no one else but me and my sister are seeing it. I'll start with a little backstory before I open up into the whole story. I'm 25, have a grandmother who's in her 80s and is really losing it to the point to where I'm officially her full-time caretaker. Grandpa died about 12 years ago, and between her dementia, diabetes, and other chronic pain, my grandmother has just deteriorated more and more, so I've had to step in. I'm very close to my grandmother, so this isn't an easy role for me to fill, but alas, I needed to do it. As I said, my grandmother can be very old and senile, but she doesn't lie about things, never really has. Now let me explain to you her house. Her husband, my grandfather, built it himself 50 plus years ago. It's a tiny little house, but fits for what they need. This was back when building codes weren't refined, so there were a lot of things on that house that needed to be redone or reworking, and never did. That's beside the point though. Around her house is a lot of yard. She pays someone to come and mow it now and then, but out back she has a massive area full of lots of plants and bushes. If I had to guess, 12 to 15 feet are just of rose bushes, which are her prized bushes. It's beautiful, especially when they're in full bloom in the spring. It really attracts a lot of deer. Now that you know the necessary details, this happened all throughout last spring. On nicer days, my grandmother enjoyed sitting out on the porch in the afternoon, knitting or reading. One afternoon, she starts storming in the house, complaining how dare somebody would come onto her property and that she needs to grab the gun. I calmed her down and had her explain what was happening. She was so flustered, but I figured she might be out of her mind, which is why I stopped her. She explained someone in a big, tall, hairy dog suit was walking around by the rose bushes, and it made her furious someone would mess around like that. I was startled but very confused by what she was telling me. I went out there and didn't see a damn thing. I was just thinking, okay, Grandma's really losing it now. I even walked out by the rose bushes and didn't see a sign of anyone being around the bushes. Some deer droppings here and there, but nothing else. The deer droppings were common. It wasn't until a few days later I was watering some of the plants on the side of the house that I heard noises over in the bushes. My grandmother was inside eating lunch, I think. She was doing something. I, thinking it was just a deer, didn't really pay any attention to the noise. I start to hear a panting noise, which I thought was odd, so I look over in the direction of the rose bushes, and peering out from the top of these bushes is this black German Shepherd dog head. I kinda stumble backward a little and gasp, and the head is just there, staring at me. It was massive. Then I see it duck down and fly out behind the bushes on all fours into the woods. It was a huge animal. It was like a huge abstract-shaped German Shepherd, the size of a moose. I only saw the body for a few seconds, but it was clear and sunny out, so I had a perfect view. Its back legs looked shorter than the front, and had bigger, more muscly arms. Its back arched up, kind of like a hyena's does, but with a head that looked to be too big for its body. I kid you not. I ran back into the house and told my grandmother that it wasn't a person. It was actually an animal that was in the yard. I wasn't scared, but intrigued at this thing. It had dark eyes, but very dark fur. It was slightly panting, but I could not see any teeth at all. I will say though that it had to have been tall because those rose bushes are huge and are easily 8+ feet tall. The thing's head was popping out of the top fully. I still don't know if it was standing on 2 legs or what to watch me. My grandmother and I would continue to see this thing on and off. Never fully though. Once later June came, we stopped seeing it, so I don't know if it left the area or what. The deer continue to come through this area most of all summer, even into the fall, just in case you're wondering if it was following the deer. I never found any carcasses or other signs of this animal was hunting the deer, but I also never went out and looked. The thing is, my grandmother wasn't even that freaked out, just annoyed more than anything. When I told her, she actually believed me and just demanded that I make it stay away from her rose bushes. Hello. I've watched your Project Feather video, the story that was supposedly sent to you. I too have worked in special projects similar across the country, but not like that. I'm going to ensure my identity stays secret to you. I can't confirm nor deny that the details in that video are true, even to an extent. One of your commentators actually found holes in the story, the timeline. He or she is a smart individual. The details given in that video have an incorrect timeline, based on the information given. Again, I can't confirm or deny the project itself and what that enlisted and entailed was true or false. What I can tell you is that similar projects are going on this very second. Maybe not with canine DNA, but there's a host of others. We'll call them bioweapons for the time being. Some with a multitude of various DNAs, including primarily human. Others will focus on just a singular animal's DNA to construct form from. I would prefer not to go into greater detail at risk of this information reaching the public, but do know there's more that goes on than you as a civilian will ever know. I have colleagues with much higher clearances than I do, and the things that are going on might seem like a science fiction movie. It's happening and there's no way to stop any of it. While it's important to be open-minded about information, it's more important to be extremely aware of your surroundings and always carry a weapon. Other human beings, cougars, bear, you name it. There are things much worse than them you need to concern yourself with that are out there and have far easier access to you than you do to them. Oh, and one more thing. That video really hit the nail on the head with the various military and governmental branches having knowledge of what's going on. Most of them don't know the full extent of what goes on, but have a much better idea than the general public, especially the local police departments. Have a good day. This actually occurred last week on January 15th, 2016. I live in outer Sunset in San Francisco. Around 7 p.m., I poked my head out the window to see if it was raining. It wasn't. I heard a loud aircraft overhead, which was several magnitudes louder than the planes that normally fly in the area. I looked to my left and saw a plane that appeared to be a commercial aircraft, but I noticed it was much larger, and the lights were super bright and creating large cones of light ahead of it. I remember thinking how neat it looked, being able to see so much of the craft and the area lit up around it with such a cloudy evening. When I tried to focus in on its lights, they flickered off, and I lost it completely. I could still hear it though, very loudly. About 10 seconds went by, and I see something come alight about 2 blocks to my right. I see a lot of commercial aircraft out there, but this was easily 4 to 6 times larger in the sky than they normally appear. The lights were strange too. I saw what appeared to be 4 white jet exhausts, and across the whole craft, there were blue and red lights in lines slowly glimmering. It moved much slower than regular planes, and was visible for about 10 seconds moving north along the beach, and then vanished for about 10 seconds. Confused, I looked around to see if anybody else had witnessed it. Lo and behold, someone on the corner of my street who was riding their bike had stopped and was gazing up at the sky in the same location as the craft had been. I shouted down to them, "Hey, did you see that? What was that?" They turned and looked at me, looked back at the sky, and then back at me. Then, without saying anything, got on their bike and rode away quickly. I could still hear the craft, so I got out onto my roof, and about a half minute later or so, I saw it come again from behind and slowly fly west out over the ocean until it vanished. I stayed on my roof watching and waiting to catch it again, but I didn't hear or see it. After about 20 minutes, regular aircraft began flying overhead per usual. My best guess is it could have been some sort of Let me preface this by stating that almost all of the encounters that I have witnessed have been with at least one other individual. The first 2 encounters happened on 2 consecutive days in 1997, and the numerous other encounters happened over the span of 90 days a year and a half ago. I do not recall being abducted. I have filed reports within an incredibly incompetent mutual UFO network. Back in 97, my buddy and I had just finished up our pizza shift at a joint. It was around 11 p.m. We were worn out and wanted to go get stoned. We were completely sober. Anyway, we drove out into a cornfield in the off year, so it was full of rye. We were about half a mile off the road. It was pitch black, and because of our vantage point, I could see headlights in any direction for a good mile. We were way out in the country, so no worries. My buddy starts breaking up the weed when I notice what I believe to be a truck headlight shine directly from behind, take a hard left, and disappear. My buddy didn't seem to notice, but I became frantic. I thought it was the cops. My friend thinks I'm messing with him and continues breaking up some really terrible brickweed. I recall looking at the stars, and one star in particular grabbed my attention. I can't tell you why, but it looked like your average star. Within 30 seconds, this star starts moving up and down, side to side, and in circles. I yelled in a panic, "What is that?" My buddy just gives a dismissive sigh, and then he looks where I'm pointing. For 5 minutes, the UFO continues to move in very fluid movements, making impossible maneuvers, and do so in complete silence. Without notice, this one object becomes 5 equally impressive star-like objects. They stayed close together. At times they moved in some kind of formation, and other times they seemed to move independently. Just as quick as they came, they fused back together as one. We were in shock, but we didn't feel like we were in harm's way. We were recapping what we witnessed, but that single UFO was still there. It wasn't moving too much. We thought things were coming to a close, but we were wrong. This time, the one object turned into at least 7 objects. The way they moved and jerked around felt aggressive to me. My friend must have felt the same way, because he said he was starting to get nervous. I told him we should go. Embarrassed, I confessed that I knew it was there for us, and I became fearful. We haul out of there, and this thing follows us to the outskirts of town. The night after, me and the same buddy walked across my apartment complex to go visit with a neighbor that was about to grill some burgers. The sun was just starting to set on a humid midsummer afternoon. We knock on the door, and my neighbor lets us sit in. With him was his girlfriend, her sister, and some random guy that I didn't know. I go out back with Ray to chit-chat while he fires up his Kingsford grill. It's just the two of us, so I take the opportunity to tell him about the previous night. The stars are just starting to come out, and in my storytelling, I pointed out one just so Ray would know exactly what I meant. I'm still pretty much tripped out, so I'm fairly excited when describing everything. I'm almost done with my story, and I notice Ray looking at the stars that are just beginning to appear. I mean, this guy is looking around everywhere. It's like he became instantly paranoid. While I was in mid-sentence, Ray points to the northeast and yells, "Like that right there?" The goosebumps. He yelled inside for everybody to come out. They did so, and soon after, the same situation as mentioned starts to occur. It went on for a bit. It went on so long that everybody but Ray and myself went inside. We ate our burgers while watching this. Behind Ray's apartment was a field. 300 yards away on the other side of the field is a tree line and creek. On the other side of that tree line is another field. This object slowly descends towards the tree line, and I open the door and yell for everybody to come back out. We watch this huge fiery orb in complete silence land on the other side of that tree line. When we lost direct sight of it, we could still see the light through the trees. Right before the light disappeared, it became very bright. We all kept asking each other if this was real. And this is the part where some of you may lose it, but hell. After several minutes and at the end of all sunlight, nothing was happening. Everybody was in and out of the house. I remember standing in the front of the back door, talking to Ray's girlfriend in the kitchen. Ray, my buddy from the previous night, and the girlfriend's sister were outside. My buddy says, under his breath, and darts past me. The sister is right behind him. Ray shoves me in the door and almost falls on top of me. The girlfriend screams, slams the door shut, and locks it. We all back away from the door, all after our "what on earth was that?" We decided it was a 4-legged, covered in brown fur, and tried to attack us. This apartment was a townhouse. We all went upstairs to get a better look. There it was, in the shadows. It was pacing around and keeping an eye out. This is when they appeared. They came out of the darkness. They were short at around 3 feet tall. Skin tone was grayish with a bit of Caucasian color. These were short grays, and there were several of them. Meanwhile, the animal thing starts to climb a utility pole. This isn't a typical utility pole. It has 6 or 8 transformers on it, and is H-shaped and kind of low. When the beast starts to climb, I watch it shapeshift to a degree. It decides to perch on one of the crossbeams. It looked right at us, but its focus seemed to be on the ETs. It acted like a guard dog, for lack of a better words. The Greys were clothed, and they had some sort of instruments. They seemed preoccupied by the field. They would look at us on occasion, but they were doing something. What exactly, I don't know. This went on for hours, and eventually, we all went and ran back downstairs. Every once in a while, I would go check to see if they were gone, and as soon as it was all clear, I ran home. That was it. For the next 4 years, I pretty much believed it was random. And then after meeting my biological father for the very first time, my ex-wife jokingly brings up my UFO stories over dinner and wine.
I was 16 when this story happened. I have family down in Alabama. They farm and own a huge amount of land down in Huntsville. My uncle owned a big house and a bunch of trailers that they put out in the woods for hunting and camping. Down south, my cousins suggest that we go out there to camp. They know I'm a city kid and they like to tease me about being from Chicago. We collect some food, kill a pig and some chickens, and bring the necessities to camp out in the woods for a few days. We get to the camp, and it's obvious that something is very wrong. The air has this weird electric smell, like right before a storm, like the ozone. We think nothing of it, and unpack and go down to the little creek to swim for a few hours. All of a sudden, some older white guy and a white teenager come out of the bushes. He has a shotgun in the crook of his arm, and says hello, and asks us what we're doing this far back into the land. We tell him about my uncle, who he knows, and say that we are out camping. He tells us to be real careful out here, and stick together when there's a big animal out in the woods. His son, who is my age, asks if he can stay to hang out with us. He says okay. We end up just goofing around the whole day, and we go back to camp, and we pull out some stuff for the campfire, even though the trailers both had kitchenettes. The crazy guy in the woods' son, Tanner, says that he wants to run home. His family's property sits up next to my uncle's, and asks if he can come out camping with us later. My cousin Rooster says that he's going to go with him since it's pretty dark, and one of the girls that is with us says that she's going to walk with him. It's about 7 o'clock right now, and it's starting to get pretty dark. They take flashlights with them, and they take the trail towards Tanner's property. The rest of us just chill and make s'mores. About 30 or 40 minutes later, there's a smell of ozone again. You can smell it over the smell of the fire. It smells like this really nasty copper smell, like right after you had a nosebleed and it stopped. It wasn't exactly like dried blood. It was that nasty metallic, back of your throat smell. We immediately think that it's some kind of electrical malfunction, or someone left a hot plate on or something. We search the trailers and nothing is on. All we can do is just smell that terrible smell. All of a sudden, we can hear these people boogieing down the path towards us. Tanner, my cousin, and one of the girls all come running into the clearing, out of breath, and they didn't even break stride. They all ran into the trailer right by where the fire was. We all immediately nope out of there and get into the trailers. They end up calming down, and even my cousin is crying his eyes out at this point. All the while, the fire is getting lower and lower, so my other cousins say, F this, and go outside to go fix one of the generators out in the shed. My cousin says, no one's going outside, and locks the front door. Ain't nobody else is going out. He's been crying too hard and his eyes are bloodshot and puffy. His pants are so dirty. He tells us that they went up to Tanner's house and talked to his father to make sure that they could go camping with us, The father said to make sure to pack a rifle, just in case. Because a few days before, one of their pigs that they farmed was ripped up and eaten. They just assumed that it was one of the big cats or maybe a coyote. So they start walking back towards where we were camping. My cousin finally stops crying and shaking, and one of the girls that were with them says that they were starting to walk back when they got a really weird feeling. They then started to hear something in the forest. It was almost pitch black at this time, so they weren't sure at first what was going on. The girl says that she heard something in the bushes off to the trail on the right, and they all beamed their flashlights over there, and there was someone standing back in the woods in a little hollow. My cousin said that they shouted at him and told him that he was scaring people out in the woods and that he should not be out there. My cousin continues and says that they realized that the guy was facing away from them, so they keep walking and they start smelling that nasty coppery ozone smell. And they say that they've looked off into the forest on the opposite side, and it's just a dude standing in the forest, backwards slightly closer to the path. So they start walking back to our campsite, and Tanner realizes that he accidentally left the rifle. As they're telling the story, the smell is super strong, even inside the cabin. They say that after they started walking faster, that a kind of low gibbering had started coming out from both sides of the woods, and they started booking it back to the trailer. The girl said that she flashed her flashlight out into the woods to the side of them, and that something jerking itself through the woods, and the gibbering got louder and louder, and when they could finally see the light of our camp, something behind them started sprinting at them as hard as they could. The natural reaction was to run away as fast as they could and into the campsite. That brings us to now. So we're out in the woods, and we are assuming at this point that it's just some rednecks or something trying to mess with us. All of a sudden, my other cousin, Junior, starts going on about how he went to school with the native kid, that he was telling him about this goat man or something. We all collectively promptly tell him to shut up because we don't need anything spooky right now. But he just keeps going on and on about how it's this goat man, and how we're in the woods and blah blah blah. Now at the time, I've never heard of the goat man, or anything like that, but a couple of years ago, before I graduated from college, I've had a friend, or a roommate I should say, that was pretty well versed in the subject. To sum it up, it's basically this guy with the head of a goat, and he can shapeshift and get among groups of people to terrorize them. It's also supposed to be this kind of Wendigo thing, kind of like a Skinwalker. It's bad mojo to even talk about it, and even worse if you see it. Keep in mind, I didn't know this back when I was 16, so my cousin is going on about this goat man and how it's going to try to get us. The girls are all terrified, and my cousins and I are trying to figure out if it's just some hillbillies or if it's actually this weird shape-shifting animal. All of a sudden, the smell just goes away. Like, to this day, I haven't even experienced anything like it. Like, usually smells fade away or get less strong, but this just literally just goes away. After an hour or so, we stop crapping ourselves enough to go back outside and to stoke the fire up again. We figure it was just some a-holes trying to F with us out in the woods, and we decide not to go home. Because of this, we decide that it might be a good idea to make the fire nice and bright, to scare away any animals that it could have been. Nothing else weird happens that night, and we stay another night, and for the main part of the night, nothing happens. About 1 in the morning, we're outside getting drunk and telling ghost stories. As someone is finishing a spooky story, I don't remember what about, that smell comes back. And it is so strong, like one of the strongest smells I've ever experienced. It's so strong, in fact, that one of the girls literally starts vomiting. I stand up and you can actually feel how clammy the air is. I say that we should get inside. This isn't right. We should have just left when we could. We all go back inside and we're standing around, and my cousin just keeps going on about how it's this goat man again. My cousin tries to shut him up. All this time I am feeling this weird feeling in my gut, and I can't figure out what it is. We end up sitting in there for a while. The smell is just as strong and we're terrified. We're all huddled in this camper. We end up cooking brats for everyone because nobody wants to go outside. The brats are packed in a 4-pack, and we have a total of 3 packs altogether. I grill them up on the stove, and everybody gets a hot dog. I get mine, and after a while, one of my cousins gets up and goes over to the pot to get another. He starts grumbling about how do I get 2 and everyone else only gets 1 hot dog. I look at him like he's an idiot. I tell him that everyone got 1 because there's only 12 brats and everyone got 1, thus 12 people. If he wanted more, he should have brought them. That's when one of the people with our group starts screaming, "Oh my gosh, get out of the cabin now." Everyone starts crying and shivering, and it finally dawns on one of the cousins what is actually happening. Me and my cousin both glance around the room, and I feel my heart sink. We all run out of the cabin, and I begin counting. There's actually 11 of us all together. How was there 12 of us when we were inside? On this trip, we brought a lot of people with us. Some people we didn't know very well, thus it was kind of difficult to keep track of who was who. We all finally calmed down, and we decide it's best that we all spend the night back inside the little camper that we have. Everyone spends the rest of the evening on their toes. I don't think many of us got any sleep that night. Did we actually stay in a room with a Skinwalker and not know about it? That's really something I wish not to think about.
Mine happened probably back in about 95 to 96-ish. At the time, I was a pizza delivery guy. I was out on a delivery, and after the delivery, I was returning to the store. While driving along the highway, I noticed 3 still lights, almost in a row, way off above the horizon, since it was evening and it was dark. Stars were visible. First thought was that they were from planes for the airport, as they were way brighter than the stars that were out. They only looked still because I was driving on the highway, and my mind was playing tricks on me. Over the course of the next few minutes, as I was continuing down the highway, I noticed the center light started moving up. It continued into the shape of a triangle. I continued to try and keep an eye on triangle of lights in the distance as the whole thing moved towards the sky. I eventually lost eyesight of this thing, behind trees and whatever else, and made it back to work. I was utterly confused by the whole thing. I didn't tell anyone because I figured they'd think I was crazy. I kind of even thought myself I was saying things and making things up. I don't know why I remembered this part. All of this happened about a week before the Super Bowl. Might have been the Friday before Super Bowl. I'm unsure. All I remember is that before the Super Bowl, I was watching Sci-Fi Channel. Some show was on about people who had seen UFOs, whatever. I was always skeptical. Then, they did a segment on numerous sites of triangle-shaped lights, and they started showing clips of the few examples that people had caught on video. It was exactly what I had seen. Never saw anything since. No one else reported any strange sights or lights that weekend that I knew of. Of course, I was a dumb kid in my early 20s, so I didn't pay attention to local news. But I'll never forget that incident. In 2005, I had just gotten a job working as a manager's assistant at a local office firm. My work was pretty close to my apartment at the time, so I would ride my bike to and from work every day. It was maybe a 20-minute bike ride at most. I loved it, but as it became colder, I would just drive. During the spring and summer, I would walk or ride my bike. I got hired on right after July 4th. I remember that. That very same month, into August, I couldn't help but feel very uncomfortable on my way to work, like I was being stalked. I'd had that feeling that I was a poor rat in a maze awaiting my doom at the end. By my apartments was this huge plot of land that the city, I guess, had never really developed. It was rather large, and I had to walk all the way around it to get to the road I needed to go on. Sometimes bums would go in and camp out in there, but I know over time the city had recently gone up in there and cleared out a bunch of them. It didn't matter if I was coming home or going to work. Every time I walked by this lot of land, I just didn't feel right. Then I began to think the worst. Some bum who's waiting to jump and kill me is just waiting for the right moment to do it. Nothing ever happened, but I began to bring a large kitchen knife with me, just in case. Not holding on to it, of course, but I had it stashed away in my belt, under my coat. Silly, I know, but I wasn't going to risk anything. Then, one morning as I'm walking, I hear some branches breaking not too far away from where I was on the sidewalk. I look over and can't really see anything. The brush and trees were thick since it was July, and it blocked a lot of the light coming through the treetops. But I could see, up high, perched higher up than my own eyes, were two glowing amber orbs looking right at me. I didn't have to stand around to think if those were eyes or not. I took off in a full sprint. Of course, this happened on a day I decided to walk to work. Of course. I got a coworker to drop me off back at home that night. I coaxed this person to come pick me up and take me home for the following 3 days. Even with perks like gas paid for, etc., they denied me, so I was on my own for getting to and from work. This was no big deal, except I had some unknown thing wanting to kill me. The days afterward, I would go as fast as I could all the way around this plot of land. The feeling still persisted. I felt watched, preyed upon. I didn't dare think about those two eyes watching me like I saw. I wouldn't be able to keep calm. I had to keep it together and remain calm just till I got away and past this area. This went on till the beginning of September, actually. I never saw anything other than that one day in July, but the feelings dissipated afterward. I even noticed the woods were full of sounds like birds and animals when before things were dead silent. It gives me the creeps to even recount this event. I still have nightmares to this day about those damn eyes staring at me. I don't want to know what they belong to. I'm posting on behalf of my boyfriend and 2 of his experiences and 1 of my own. A few years back, my boyfriend was on his job site and he called me late explaining that he had seen something that looked like it was trying to cloak itself, but failing to. Kind of glitching in a way. It was near a hedge and he told me he could clearly see the outline of what appeared to be a human figure. He said it was there and then it was gone, almost as soon as he looked away. I have had reoccurring dreams of seeing through or mirror people that have become unsettling and stressful to the point I don't want to sleep, and this has only been happening recently, the last 2 months. They are basically the same. I'm in the river near my home, surrounded by these beings or creatures, and I feel very vulnerable and scared. It's so realistic, it's almost like a lucid dream, or an OBE. Very strange and happens weekly. The topping that made me want to post this is that last night, my boyfriend had seen this very weird translucent thing again, after years of not seeing it or even thinking of it. Now, I haven't told him about my dreams, and still don't plan to, just as of yet. And I find this timing to be so odd and a bit frightening. I'm a huge believer in almost all otherworldly things, so I am a little bit on edge. He said it was by our back hedge against the fence, and there was a clear outline of where it was standing. He said it glimmered and its body kind of waved. He described it as looking at a reflection of our hedge in the water. He has been backing up slowly from it, and when he glanced away for a second, it was gone. He then came into the room and woke me up, and I'll admit, he looked really concerned and a bit terrified. He's not really one to believe in these things. Has anyone had any experiences or have heard such things? I found one article with a Google search of a few witness accounts of almost identical creatures, but nothing truly substantial. I'm very curious about this and am dying to figure out what it could be. Seeing and listening to all these encounters about what people claim is the Dogman brings up horrific childhood memories of a time I went camping in my own backyard. Now, I'm not claiming to have seen one of these things necessarily by myself because I can't explain it. But I am claiming that what I saw is what I saw. I was not dreaming. I was not high or drunk. I was 100% in the moment and visualized everything fully. I want to say I was about 9 at the time, and I loved the outdoors, still do. My dad operated a very lucrative and successful auto body business, so we had a nice house, lots of yard with lots of trees. As a kid, it was a dream come true. I was always outside playing sticks, building forts, Anything I could think of to do was fun. I was really into survival and would want to spend my days out there learning my environment. In fact, I got pretty good at it, even as a youngster. It wasn't long until I convinced my parents to start letting me camp out in the yard and sleep out there. They thought I was crazy because I had a nice warm bed to come to, but that didn't interest me. I wanted to be out where I felt most comfortable, even though technically I was also most vulnerable. Well, at the time. This was in the summer, so I turned in late in my tent. I remember falling asleep like normal and waking up to the most terrifying feeling. It was just a strong sense of something being wrong. Enough of this feeling that it woke me up out of a dead sleep. Being 9 years old, I couldn't understand how to process these emotions or understood what this meant until I started to hear noises from my left, coming closer in my direction. I don't know what in my body shot me up out of my tent, but it's like my brain froze and my body made up its own mind to go. As I'm climbing up out of my tent, mind you, I'm still not even mentally processing what's fully going on. I look over to where the noise is coming from, and out of the trees and bushes comes this werewolf heading right in my direction. I scream and run for the house as fast as I could. I never once looked back. I ran in the house going crazy, woke my mom and dad up. They both started freaking out, thinking something happened. I explained to them what I saw, parents consoled me, and my dad went out to investigate. He didn't see anything or any signs of anything, but I was sobbing and scared beyond my mind. They kept telling me I was dreaming, but I told them the feeling that I had, and I heard this monster coming before it revealed itself out of the bushes. They couldn't refute that. They only kept telling me it was a dream. I know it wasn't. I locked eyes with this thing for more than a couple of seconds. It was not a person in a suit. It was not my imagination. This looked like a monster straight out of Hollywood. The moon was bright that night too, so I saw way more details of it than I ever want to remember. I can't explain to you why I woke up. I can't explain to you why I had those horrible feelings like something was wrong, but I did. And I believe it was because this thing was coming to hurt me. It was maybe 10 seconds from me, hearing the noise to leaving my tent, and seeing it come out of the brush. It continued walking directly to me. Not as fast-paced though, just average. This thing was huge and had huge strides, so I was not going to wait for it to get me. I can't judge how many yards away it was, but enough that it gave me time to reach my house. If I had to guess, maybe 50? Had I stood there though, it would have been right up on me, and God only knows what it would have done to me. I don't remember its eyes at all. I don't remember a smell or anything else. I sure remember the feeling and seeing this thing, but that's about it. The more I think about this, the more I begin to question. Had it known I was out there and was waiting for the right time to get me? What did it randomly choose to come after me, if that's what it was doing? These are questions I wish I had the answers for, but unfortunately, I don't. It's taken me years to rationalize it as something that I can't explain and that I'm not crazy. This did happen to me, and I've just had to take time to accept it. I only recently discovered online communities with very similar experiences of other individuals that all come together to relay their encounters and not feel like a nut job for it.
When I was about 12, my family bought a fishing cabin by a small river about 70 miles from our home. On our first visit to stay in this cabin, it was kind of a work vacation, meaning we were painting and fixing and stuff, as well as fishing. One of the people who lived near this cabin came over to say hi and introduce herself. During the course of her visit, she told us, "Don't be afraid of the purple glowing mist you will see. It's just from the UFOs and it won't hurt you." All of us kids snickered at this while elbowing each other, so my mom chased us off and apologized to the woman. She later yelled at us for being rude. 2 nights later, we were out at night fishing with our father. The stars were amazing, looking without the city's lights pollution, and we were all pointing at different constellations and challenging each other to name them. My youngest brother pointed out to a perfect circle of about 7 bright stars and asked, "What are those called?" We all kind of froze and stared because, well, there's no such constellation, yet here it was.
While we were looking at it, the stars took off differently and silently in different directions and vanished all over the surrounding horizons. We ran. Looking back, it was stupid to run. I mean, the things were already gone, but we were spooked, and we ran as fast as we could back to the cabin where my mother was sleeping. About half the way there, our dad overtook us and ran straight into the cabin ahead of us, slamming the door. When we get back into the cabin, he told us, "Just shut up and go to bed." He sounded angry, so we did just that. The next morning at breakfast, when we tried to talk about it, my dad angrily said that he didn't remember any of that and to stop with the stories. My sister asked, "Why did you run?" And he said that he was tired and wanted to go to bed. He was tired, so he ran? My dad can be a real goober sometimes. This wasn't the only time we saw things in the sky while staying there, but it was the most interesting. We tried on a few occasions to get pictures, but it was the early 60s, and cameras sucked half the time back then. At least the cheap kid cameras we had did. We were afraid to ask Dad's good camera for that. We only had that cabin for a few years when my dad suddenly sold it. We never could get him to talk about that night. He would firmly deny it every time we tried. Never did see the purple glowing mist though, and we looked for it. I have an encounter from my childhood that has stuck with me forever. It was such a strange experience. I don't really know what it was, or certain what happened, but I am 100% that I saw what I saw. I grew up in suburban Missouri, right around the St. Louis area. There was one summer night when I was 11 or 12, when I was out riding my bike with a friend in my neighborhood. We rode until 9 p.m., and at this point, it was just a little past dusk, so we headed back to my house. It wasn't pitch black since the sun had just set, so we could still see pretty well. My friend rode ahead of me, and because she wanted to call some other girl to have her come over, and I stayed back to pet a dog. The dog left, and I started riding my bike again, and I looked across the street and saw a chunky black humanoid figure that was maybe 10-ish feet tall, all black, and it was standing next to a ranch-style house, touching the branches on the tree next to it. I fell off my bike as soon as I saw it, but never felt scared or anything. I watched it for a couple of minutes, but it could have only been like 30 seconds. You know how dumb kids' brains work with time. As it was just looking at this tree, it was quiet and I never heard a sound come out of its mouth. And even if it took a step, I couldn't hear anything. It just decided to walk back into the small wooded area behind the house, and I never saw it again. It was an amazing experience, and I have such a positive emotion associated with it. I just have no clue what I saw that night. So, I moved to Texas a few years back. Found a nice girl to share my life with, and things have been great. Well, just a few months ago, we both went out to this lookout point outside of town to make love in the back of my car. We get to the lookout. We're the only ones there. It was great. We got to the deed, and in the course of it, I'm on top of her, and we're going to town. Her and I's heads are both closest to the rear of the vehicle. She's lying on her back, and as she looks up, she can see directly out the back window. We're in the middle of doing a business deal here, and I'm not even focused on anything else. She pauses for a second, and her face starts to change from a confused look to a horrified one, followed by screaming. I quickly look up, thinking somebody's outside of her window, and it was a fucking scary wolf face looking in our vehicle. It was breathing hot breath on the window, and you could clearly see the condensation on the glass. This thing had striking yellow, reddish eyes that had tiny pupils dialed in on me. It wasn't even 3 feet away from my head. It had a massive face, and almost an expression like it was grinning at us. I was paralyzed with fear, and after about 2 seconds, this thing stands up, since it was crouching to look in our window, and walks off. Naked, panicking, and scrambling to get our clothes back on, my girlfriend demands to take her back home now. We got the hell out of Dodge before that thing could come back. I'm close friends with an individual whose name I will not mention, but has worked years in the fish and game, wildlife, and other branches of park ranging. I've gotten him to tell me a lot of details of questions that I had, on the guise that I wouldn't release his name or identity. Fair enough, I thought. I'm a huge researcher into Bigfoot, Dogman, and all other forms of cryptids and things that go bump in the night. The entire search and rescue don't tell the public really much of anything, and after some things, I was told I can understand why. The general public would be terrified to camp, hike, or really much of anything, and they would lose out on so much money. He's told me about finding bodies that aren't surprising if you've listened to any other park ranger tales. It's the conditions these bodies are found that are disturbing. Luckily, he hasn't run across any children, but found a few adults torn apart with great force and looked to be eaten by a large canine. The only things at the scene were blood, some hair with DNA on it that I guess pointed to an unknown canine. There have been searches he's been on where he felt like he was being stalked down by a large predator, but never saw a thing. He's had multiple personal encounters with Bigfoot in a variety of situations, but told me any encounter he's ever had with them was never aggressive. He believes them to be very curious and reserved beings that like to be hidden. The encounters he has had with Bigfoot would appear in the same area these bodies were in, but long after these Bigfoot were no longer frequenting the area, suggesting that some other animal drove the Bigfoots out of the area, which is when they found the bodies with the canine DNA on them. It's unclear whether these other animals are responsible for the death of several hikers and hunters in the area. He hasn't seen these things per se. His other friends who have seen these animals call them direwolves, just by the sheer size alone. I'm not going to make this a long email, but I thought it's good to open lines of communication and give you bits of information here and there. I'll probably see if I can talk to him a little more and dig out some really juicy information for you. Until next time.